Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. I'm Frank Abe with Tomiko Nimura, and I'm here at my mother's home in Santa Clara, California, where I grew up. And as my Kibe Nisei mother would say when she came to the front door over there, when she came home, she'd say, Tadaima. So thank you for joining us live for this Tadaima virtual community pilgrimage panel on our graphic novel on Japanese American resistance to wartime incarceration. As I say, Tomiko Nimura is here, and for this program we thought we'd do something a little different. Rather than just talk about the book as we have since its publication in May, today we want to get a different perspective. Today we'll hear from the children of the three characters we feature in the book. We'll hear shortly from Jim Akutsu's son, Phillip, who's a professor of psychology at California State University. There's Phillip. Hello, Phillip. We'll hear from Hiroshi Kashiwagi's son, Soji, a playwright and theater director in Pasadena, California. Hi, Soji. And Mitsuye Endo's daughter, Wendy, who lives in Chicago, where her parents settled after the war. Hi, Wendy.
Hi.
Good to see you. And
Thank you.
Wendy works as a teacher's assistant at a Montessori school in Illinois. So, as most viewers know, We Hereby Refuse is a new graphic novel published by Chin Music Press and the Ring Museum of Seattle. It presents the stories of three Nisei who refuse to submit to their imprisonment in American concentration camps without a fight. So Kimiko, you can share the screen. We'll just bring you viewers up to date and the characters. Jim Akutsu here refused to be drafted from the camp at Minidoka. He tried to enlist before and after Pearl Harbor, but rejected for flat feet. His father is separated from their family by the FBI and sent to a Justice Department internment camp in Montana. At Minidoka, Jim disagrees with a form of a government questionnaire and refuses to agree with one question. He refuses to be drafted from camp a year later until his citizenship is clarified, and he serves 2 years in a federal prison. On his return to Seattle, Jim's taunted by his former classmates who served in the war, and Jim's not shy, as you can see, about standing up to them. And then after the war, Jim testified to the Congressional Fact-Finding Commission on redress. Hiroshi Kashiwagi and his family are removed from their farm outside Sacramento and sent to Tule Lake when it was just another relocation camp. At Tule Lake, he explodes with frustration here in this panel. I'm sick of saying yes to everything. Yes, I'll go to camp. Yes, I'll serve in the Army. Yes, I'll declare my loyalty. I'll prove my loyalty by standing for my rights as an American. That's Hiroshi. He refuses government pressure to sign the loyalty oath and is threatened with prison time and hefty fines. Under duress, he signs no. He remains at Tule Lake when it's fortified as the WRA's segregation camp. And later, he gives in to family pressure to renounce his U.S. citizenship and avoids being deported only after enlisting the aid of attorney Wayne Collins. So after the war, Wayne Collins fights 10 years to restore Hiroshi's citizenship and that of 5,000 others who had renounced. By contrast, Mitsuye Endo's story is straightforward. She's a reluctant recruit to a lawsuit contesting her imprisonment. First, she was part of a class action complaint to keep her from being fired from a job at the state of California. Her attorney in that case then recruits her as the plaintiff in a habeas corpus case contesting the detention of American citizens in wartime. The government offers her a chance to leave camp if she drops her case. But instead of choosing her own freedom, she decides to stay in camp for 2 more years in order for her case to reach the Supreme Court, where her victory ultimately forces the government to shut down the camps. Educators have said they really appreciate having the story of a strong woman to teach. So here we've introduced a new story they can teach of a woman with agency in the incarceration story. After the war, Mitsuye goes to Chicago, where her parents and sisters have already resettled. She and her new husband raise a family, and when her children have grown up, she recalls the inevitable conversation with them about Tule Lake, about Topaz, and you can see how they react to the story of camp. So that's the quick summary of the characters in the story. This leads us to our first guest. Let's bring in Wendy Tsutsumi Weiner.
Weiner.
Wendy Weiner. Thank you, Wendy.
It's okay.
Wendy lives in a community just north of central Chicago. And Wendy, so I'm so glad we're finally able to get you a copy of the novel last month. I'm really curious, what were your first thoughts upon reading it?
I had three emotions that came to me, and they can say it was sad, angry, and then proud at the very end. So yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say this is the first chance we've really had a chance to really talk in person. We've emailed in the past, very briefly.
Right.
So I'm glad that you liked the book, quite frankly.
Yeah, I did very much so, and it was easy to read because of the way it was written. But I'd say it was a process of reading, trying to get all of that in. I mean, there were some things as far as the law and, about the war. It took me a while. I had to read it over again, just to process all this information in. But it was very well written. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you. It was 4 years of work, as
Yes.
you know.
Yes. Yeah.
The story is new to all readers, because your mother has always been an enigma to people, because she was a name in the history books, a name in the court case, but she was also, we understand, very private.
Yes.
What can you tell us about that her desire to be privacy? Why didn't she talk about her case?
She was a very quiet, shy woman. When they chose her, she was like, "Why me? Why do you want me? Choose somebody else to do this." She didn't want anything, like coming upon her, like, "Oh, this is what I did." She was not like that at all. She was not a showy person at all, and she just kind of wanted to, go along her life. But she was, I guess, the perfect candidate.
She certainly was.
To represent, the Nisei.
Perfect plaintiff, as Jim Purcell said, because she didn't speak Japanese, or didn't go to Japanese school, apparently.
Right.
And had a brother in the U.S. Army.
Right.
And didn't go to Japanese school, or subscribe to Japanese language newspapers.
Right.
Fred Korematsu's daughter, Karen, tells a story about how she was in high school when the name Korematsu came up in class, and she runs home, talks to her father, and says, "Is that you?" How did you first come to learn about your mother's story?
My mom, she kept this a secret for a very long time.
Really?
I think she did it because she wanted to protect us, didn't really want to talk about it. It was something that she said was not a very good thing in her life. I learned about it by reading And Justice for All, John Taishi's book.
Yes, John Taishi's.
And my mom had it in her house, and I looked at it and I saw my mom's name and I started reading. I was like, "Oh my God, what is this?" So my mom was not one to volunteer any information. I usually, asked her the questions, and she would tell just enough, not a lot of details, and that's how I learned about it.
I see. And what was your reaction? What was your reaction when you heard that?
I was shocked. Yeah. How could she keep this a secret? How could she not tell us? So,
Did you talk to Wayne about it at all?
No.
Your brother?
Now I do, but I didn't know what to ask him. I didn't know what to say about it because I really didn't have any details. Until later on, my mom would be over my house and I would ask her a few things like, what was it like, as far as food, rations, what was it like? Even the barracks, what was that like living in there?
Mm-hmm. And what'd she say?
She said that it was not good. The walls were very thin, no privacy. You heard a lot of people talking, babies crying, stuff like that. She said as far as food-wise, she said she was very grateful that her mother, my grandmother, was a good cook. So whatever that she got, the food, she was able to make, meals to eat that were edible for them. She said one time my aunt, they had to always stand in line for things, and that had a really terrible impact on one of her sisters. when she was her younger sister. I mean, all these stories, but she never told us about it unless I asked the questions.
Did she ever talk about her employment case in Sacramento when she was fired and how?
No,
Okay,
no, yeah, and I didn't know they asked, so yeah, she never said. I didn't know, and the fact that she just said, "Oh, I worked for the state of California," and what she did, and that was about it. Yeah.
Well, over the years when you were growing up, didn't any people call the house asking for her? Reporters or scholars come
They
asking to talk.
at that time I had moved out already, so I really didn't know. Um, they may have, and she may have decided she didn't want to give interviews. She was very private. So,
Yeah. I was going to ask you. There's a story that after the war she had an unpleasant experience with a reporter, and that may have been one reason why she didn't give more interviews. But
see, I had no idea about that. Yeah.
and then in the book, we did show that drawing of her washing dishes, and
Oh,
then, right.
I was like,
And
I don't remember that. Yeah, but probably so. Yeah.
okay,
Yeah.
I was worried about that. I wanted to ask you about that scene. Ross Ishikawa, the artist, drew. He invented the dishwashing action, but in 1976, your mother gave that one interview to Carol Bielmeyer from the
Yes.
Oral History
Yes.
Project Fullerton,
Right.
and Carol says, "Have you talked to your children about the exclusion, internment, and the Endo case?" And your mother said, "Yes, I have, but not in great detail." What was
Right.
their reaction to it? They said, "Quote, why did you let them put you in camp? We wouldn't do it."
Right, right, right. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I can see us saying that. But at the time, we were, of the age. I think might have been in my 20s. Why would you allow that, Mom? And I don't even remember what her reply was. I mean, what could she say? What could we do? Maybe she said that. What else?
That's in fact what she did say. Yeah, something
Yes.
along those
What else
lines.
could
Yeah,
we do? Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
So, but I also mentioned the fact that the book, my grandson, he was 11 years old. He's in 6th grade. And when I first got the book, I was opening it up and he happened to look over my shoulder and he said, "Oh, wow, I'd like to read that." And I think the appealing of the way it was written. So, yeah, I would love for him to read about his great grandmother. Yes.
And I've, in my experience, I've had this experience before where the work is able to connect generations.
Yes. 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 Yes.
Connect your
Absolutely.
grandson to his grandmother's story. So I'm
Right.
really,
And my daughters are very, I have this book. And so I said, you're going to have to share it. And you're so kind to, have a copy ready for
we'll
them.
send
Yes.
more when I get back to
Yes.
Seattle. Yeah,
That would be great.
you're welcome. Quick question: the drawings and the dialogue. Did it look like your mother in the drawings, and it did kind of capture the way she talked?
The drawing absolutely was incredible. And I thank you, Ross, right? Ross?
Yes, yes.
Yes. And the writing of the way she was talking, even, I mean, I know it's like a cartoon, but even the way her face and the way she kind of sat in the chair, it was just life like my mother would be. She was very proper. No, she was a very proper woman, very quiet, and yes, it was perfect.
Well, that's a huge relief, Wendy, because the one thing we didn't want to do was contrive a character or put words in her mouth.
Oh, no,
And
no. Yeah, even my daughter goes, "That's Grandma Mitzi." She saw it. Yeah, so.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
Last question. One of the things we couldn't squeeze into the book was the story of your father.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Well,
can-
it's funny because my daughter said, "Oh, they call him Papa Kenny." She said, "Is Papa Kenny in the book too?" And I said, "I don't think so." She was kind of sad, but I said, "I don't think so." Yeah.
It was tangential to her actual journey, So we had to kind of eliminate all those things. But quickly, tell us a story about how they met.
Well, my dad was born and raised in Honolulu, Hawaii. With his, dad and mom and two younger sisters, and a lot of this came from my brother because he knows a little bit more than I did. And then he went to McKinley High School. After that, he went to Sacramento State College, and then I believe he met my mom at Tule Lake and Topaz Camp. And then my dad was, pardon?
And they fell in love and got married.
Well, he left. My mom stayed because of her case. And then my dad went, he was a big football player. So he went to Iowa to play football. And then, my mom, was released and she relocated to Chicago. My dad went looking for my mom in Chicago, and then they were married in Chicago. So that's the story. That's the story. Not in detail, but that's the story.
And very quickly, last question would be, after the war, your mother worked for the mayor's office of race relations or something. But after that, just quickly tell us about her life after the war.
Her life after the war, you know what? She worked, and after she had worked, she had retired, and she just wanted to have just a private life, enjoying her family. And my dad had passed away in '87, and so she just enjoyed having her family, her grandchildren. She had 8 grandchildren, and she just loved doing that, just having her family with her.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you, Wendy. We'll come back.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And we'll come back some questions later. Kimiko, now we'll toss it over to Tamiko and Soji Kashiwagi for the Kashiwagi story.
All right. Hi, Soji. How are you?
Hey, Tamiko. How's it going?
Good. It's so nice to see you. And I want to talk a little bit about some early memories of growing up with your dad. Many of them might be before I was born. We're a little over 10 years apart, you and I.
Mm-hmm.
Talk a little bit about The Betrayed, and then talk about the graphic novel and carrying forward your dad's legacy. So let's jump right in. What was it like growing up as your dad's middle son?
Well, it was always a positive thing, I would say. A lot of people knew my dad in the community, either the Buddhist community or the JA community, or he'd be out there as an actor, as a writer or poet, appearing at community events. And so inevitably, when you grow up in the JA community, the Nisei especially would ask, "What's your last name?" And then once they find out your last name, Kashiwagi, they would say, "Oh, are you related to Hiroshi Kashiwagi?" "Yes." "Oh, I know your dad," and so there was always that connection. And that always kind of served as like a foot in the door or a door opener throughout my life. It's always been a positive thing to have that connection of being his son.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you also then if you can talk about the first time that you knew really what camp resistance meant, or being a no-no was, or what your dad's role in all of this was.
Yeah, it probably maybe high school or college. You start hearing about these no-no boys, and of course you heard about the veterans and the 442 story. And so, it was kind of weird because my dad didn't talk about being a no-no, but then there was this stigma attached to being one. There was one of being disloyal. There was one of being a troublemaker. There was one of being the bad Japanese American people who, in camp. And then I look at my dad, and none of those, he didn't fit the description of any of those, as far as being disloyal. He never talked bad about the country or tried to sway us in any negative way about the country, right? So I didn't see that as being disloyal at all. As far as being a troublemaker, I didn't see that at all either, in his interaction in the community and society. And then, it would just, it didn't fit. It didn't, but the thing is, we never really talked about what a no-no was or what it meant. It wasn't discussed at home. And so it was just something that was there but not talked about.
So I thought you would have learned about camp earlier.
I think I really
earlier, but not resistance, maybe.
Right. I remember being 13, around 13, when I really first learned about camp. I saw an exhibit at the Buddhist Church of San Francisco, and it was all about camp. The whole room had photos of camp and the slideshow. And my dad actually spoke at that event around 1975. And so, yeah, that's where I first got an understanding of what was going on with camp.
We had talked a little bit, and I remember you reading something that you wrote about this. In college, you ended up writing an article about the 442nd, and I was going to ask you to talk a little bit about writing that article and then what you remember of your dad's reaction or possible reaction to it.
Yeah, I was working for, I think it was in high school, maybe. I was working for a Chinese American newspaper in San Francisco and got an assignment to cover the exhibit at the Presidio Army Museum on the 442nd. And I had never really heard about them before. And I went to the museum and I met Eric Saul, who's like this authority on the 442nd. And he sat me down and he proceeded to tell me the most amazing stories of the exploits of the 442nd and everything they did. And so I wrote this story, and then in college, I went back to some of the same sources and wrote another article about the 442nd in college for a college magazine. And so, yeah, I remember showing it to my dad, but I had gone to bed because it was late at night, and I just handed him the text, and he read it, and I could hear in the next room, I could hear him crying after reading it. And so at the time, I'm lying there in bed and I'm listening to this, and I didn't exactly know what that meant. Was it because I wrote about the 442nd and he wasn't part of it? Was he upset about that? Or was he reacting? Was he moved by the article and had that reaction? I didn't really know. And of course, the next day, being good JAs, we didn't talk about it. It didn't come up in conversation. So to this day, I don't know what his reaction to the article was. But to his credit, during that time, he never discouraged me from telling that story. And never talked down about the 442nd and their position or the SS position. He never did any of that. He also didn't talk about his own position. Once again, I guess you're getting a theme here of really not talking about that. So that's kind of the story behind that.
Thank you. And I mean, I don't remember your dad as an easy crier or anything like that. So it would have been something pretty powerful, right, to move him in that respect, for you to be able to hear him reacting that way. So there's so much more under the surface, right?
Yeah.
You say.
There's only a few times I remember him crying, really, and so that was one of them.
That was one. Wow. Thank you. I wanted to talk just a little bit about his play, The Betrayed, because I feel like it really was his, maybe not olive branch, but his, reaching out for making bridges of understanding, right, with folks who answered yes, yes, and no, no. So it's about two young Nisei who meet in Tule Lake, Grace and Tack. and they fall in love, and they answer the questionnaire differently in Act 1. And in Act 2, they reunite after decades of not seeing each other. So I was wondering if you had thoughts about why he wrote it and maybe what its significance is for you.
I think he wrote it, he really felt bad that there's been this split in the community between those that said yes, yes, and no, no. And he was looking for a reconciliation, and which could lead to a healing. But to even get to that point, you really need to understand what was going on at the time with those questions and the responses to their questions and why they answered the way they did. And so I think he wanted to present both sides of the story, and I think he did it fairly. He didn't slant it to one side or the other. He used this couple in camp to present both sides, and then they end up being on opposite sides of the questions, and they break up, and then 40 years later they meet again, and you discover the consequences of those answers and how it affected their lives. And so I think he was really going for a healing, and that's why he wrote it, I think.
Yeah, I think so. I also want to talk a little bit about the pilgrimages, because he's been such a central part of the Tule Lake pilgrimage. But you, I guess, had not gone to one until 2006. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah.
Because you've been speaking at them since the 70s, right?
Yeah, my dad spoke at the first one, I believe it was in 1975. It was the second Tule Lake pilgrimage, and he read his poem, A Meeting at Tule Lake, and had been going fairly regularly ever since then. But I had never gone, and I don't know exactly why, but I hadn't gone until 2006. And so from that year on, and it's only been now, 15 years, is where I really kind of started understanding what the Tule Lake was, what happened there, and how my dad was involved, what his story was at Tule Lake. Because like I said, it was something that he didn't talk about with us, and then in public, he would often say, Tule Lake is not really my favorite subject to talk about. And obviously that was true. And so, it wasn't until then that I really got it. And then from getting it, I wanted to start telling it and presenting his side of the story, or the no-no side of the story, so people will have a better understanding. Yeah. And so in 2010, that's when we produced his play, The Betrayed. And a lot of people, I think what the play did for them, they called it eye-opening, because like many of us, they didn't have any idea of what happened at Tule Lake, what the issues were, what those questions did. And so this was really educational, but also emotional, because so many people who normally, wouldn't acknowledge being a Tule Lake descendant, they were coming out and emailing us, oh yeah, my father was there, but they never really talked about it, but the play really brought out all the issues. And now I have a better understanding of my father, my mother, because of what happened at Tule Lake. It really affected how they were as people and how they ended up raising their kids as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to ask you, then this is a good way to transition into the graphic novel, and ask with some trepidation what it was like reading We Hereby Refuse for the first time, and what kind of thoughts were running through your head.
I had never read a graphic novel before, So I didn't know what to expect. I said, I was thinking, is this a comic book, or exactly what is graphic about this novel? Or that's where I was starting. And then I was thinking, as a writer myself, okay, well, how are they going to do this? 3 different stories and my dad's story. So I started reading, and then I realized the enormous amount of research and work and interviews. Because of being a student of the whole incarceration myself, I'm pretty aware of the history. And I know from reading your book that you guys like pulled from so much different sources, historical background and research. There's just a ton of it. It's jam packed, right? And I know it's spot on accurate, right? When you pick up the book and you start reading, you go, wow, you end up really learning a lot about what happened, not just at Tule Lake, but the whole incarceration. You kind of everything is included in that, in the background and before the war, and what was going on with the JACL and working with the government and the whole thing. So that was really good. And then in looking at my dad's story, I was like, okay, how are they going to do this? And I saw what you did, knowing my dad's work. I saw you pull from like plays and stories and interviews he's done and books he's written. It was like pulled from all over the place and then sort of put together to form his narrative, his story, which I thought was really cool. So, very, very well done, and kind of captures the feeling of, I wouldn't call him a heroic character in the book. He's just a guy who was caught up in something that he had no idea was going to happen and shouldn't have been happening in the first place. I felt like that was who he was. I mean, because he was, before the registration and the questions, he was actually having fun, going around camp, putting on plays. He was acting in various American plays, ironically enough, for people. They would go from like barracks to barracks, and put on these shows. And people would come and pay a little money, and he was having a great time for his captive, as I call it, the captive audience. But that all ended with the questionnaire controversy. Tule Lake became a segregated camp, and his theater group ended up breaking up and never got back together again. So yeah, that I thought was captured well, of just this whole Tule Lake scene, which was really presented as an oppressive place, a dark, oppressive place, which you never see, or you've never seen in other books about camp. And credit to, was it Matt Sasaki?
Right.
Who I saw an interview, and he said, working late at night on the illustrations, he said he had to go to some very dark places in order to draw what he drew. And you could tell it's very dark, it's very stark, and you could feel the oppression that the people went through. And that was pretty devastating, to learn that it was that bad, on the people, our people, and so that was an eye-opening moment for me.
Yeah. Great. Our family, right?
Yes.
I didn't realize that our grandpa actually was protesting against the draft, but also before that, he was also resistant to the idea of the theater. Did you know this, or do you remember this?
No, I didn't know about that.
Yeah, so he actually, Hiroshi Shimizu of the Tule Lake Committee sent us some materials about this, but he objected to the idea of building a theater because it was using inmate funds to pay for
Oh,
the construction.
uh-huh.
So, ironically, he didn't get his way, and your dad got to perform. But yeah. All these things that keep coming to the surface, right, as the results of doing this work.
Yeah, it turns out our grandfather was quite an activist, and he
Mhm.
was the first Issei to get arrested, and in
Mhm.
protesting the registration. And they have written reports specifically naming him and talking about him, which is very interesting. He did a lot of speaking, public speaking out against the registration.
Right, and he
Yeah.
got arrested from within camp by the FBI.
Yeah, I think somebody inside, um, you know, squealed on him, basically, ratted him out, because he was talking in Japanese. So it would have been have to be somebody who understood Japanese enough to tell the
Right.
administration. And next thing you know, Grandpa's being shipped off to, New Mexico as a, camp
Klamath
troublemaker.
Falls, Klamath Falls Jail, and then Sharp Park near San Francisco, and then Santa Fe.
That was his route. Okay.
That
Yeah.
was where he went. So yeah,
Okay.
all these things. Okay,
Yeah.
so last question here, or last kind of set of things. I want to talk a bit about carrying forward your dad's legacy. You're his
Hmm.
middle son, certainly the most public and vocal of the three. And I wanted to know if you felt that your dad's history influenced your work with Grateful Crane, your performing arts ensemble.
Yeah, definitely. As well, especially since 2006, I feel like a responsibility to tell his side of the no side of the story, because up to this point, it really has been suppressed. It's been written out or not included in our history. And so, I really wanted to, I was out there, wasn't true. And so now I feel like it's the time for it to come out.
I agree. Well, I hope that we've helped contribute to that legacy as well in the graphic novel. We're going to pass the mic back over to Frank and Jim Akutsu's son, Phillip. Thanks for talking and thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Tamako. And and now we have Phillip Akutsu joining us from Sacramento. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. I should issue a disclaimer to the audience that Phillip and I go back a long ways. Phillip, want to quickly tell the story of how we met?
Yeah, Frank, I think you thought we met when you came to our family home and was interviewing my dad about the internment and about his relationship with John Okada, who was the author of No Boy. But I had to remind you that in actuality that we met when I was in high school, when you started an after-school program for public speaking to try to help young Asian Americans to find their voice and to be able to articulate their thoughts and ideas. And
It's interesting you take it that way, Philip, because it was an acting class from the Asian Exclusion Act.
Okay.
And so you were in a theater class for acting, but what you took from it was public speaking, which led you to, I think, a class president or something like that.
Yeah, so three of us who went through that whole process with you, we ended up getting very confident and wanting to run for student officers, and three of
Wonderful.
I don't know, 7 or 8 of us ended up being leaders in our high school. So
Wonderful. Well, we're glad to have helped. Philip, same questions to you. When did your father first tell you about his wartime experiences? Did you ask him, or did he tell you?
No, my father talked about the internment and his resistance, and very early. I would say in elementary school, he sat me down and said that Some people in the Japanese American community may say bad things about he and my uncle Gene, that they took a stance to be resistors, and he told me why they did, and that he never really regretted that. He said that he had to take a stance, and so did my uncle Gene, that they had to take a stance to fight for the rights of their parents and the other people in the camps.
Yeah.
So from a very early age, my father talked about this, and I knew about this. So.
I mean, we hear so much about silence in the Nisei family, but I mean, your dad and your uncle were different because they sat you down and talked about it. Ross Ishikawa did the color drawings for your father's story. I never asked you, Phillip, what was your reaction when I sent you the book and you saw the drawings, seeing his face, the way he was drawn? Does it look like him to you? Is it weird to see your father as a cartoon character?
Yeah, it's a little different, I mean, to see your father in a graphic novel, right? Drawn in this way. Some of the images, I mean, it's clear it's him. I think it looks exactly like some of the pictures I'm sure that Ross used to draw him off of. Some of the other pictures, I'm not as clear, but again, there's not a lot of pictures of my dad when he was in his 20s, right? So I'm sure Ross is having to figure out what he might look like, and so in that sense, I would say, clearly there are pictures that I think friends and family would recognize my dad in the graphic novel, but there are a few where I wasn't exactly sure the resemblance was there for me.
Okay. Well, the way, how about the way he talked in the dialogue balloon? Does it sound like him?
Yeah, I that sounded very much. I mean, I think many of the parts of this story I had heard from him word for word. You knew him. He was not shy about talking about the internment and why he resisted. And, he really felt that more Japanese Americans and those who were interned needed to have spoken about this, right, in the 50s and 60s. And I think a lot of people wanted to put that behind them. But my father said that we needed to speak up so people would never forget what happened, and that it wouldn't happen again to the Japanese Americans, and it shouldn't happen to any other group, right? And so he said that if we didn't speak up, then what would happen is people would forget. And then what would happen is it would happen again. So I think that was the motivation for him to share, I think, his stories and to talk to other people about the internment and to let them know about a very important part of his experience and the history of the Japanese Americans.
Your father was so kind to me and generous, kind of taking me under his wing and, spending a lot of time with me to talk about things that I was very interested and curious about. It just occurred to me, Phillip, that maybe that's why John Okada and he got along so well after the war too, because your father was very voluble. I mean, he loved to talk, and I can see where Okada would just kind of gravitate towards someone like your father.
Yeah, the little bit that he used to talk about John is that John was more of a quiet individual, and but very interested in what contributed to his decision and my uncle Gene's decision to resist and what it was like for him. And so parts of No Boy uses, I think, that material to shape the characters. My father isn't the main character in the book, but there are little parts and pieces of his life. And I think because of that relationship he had with John for several years after the war, where they would get together and as they were building their lives after the internment. And I know John served in the military, they sort of were finding their way right after all of these things. And so they did spend a lot of time for several years, and I think they got along pretty well. Yeah.
You mentioned, I should mention for the audience, John Okada is the author of the novel No Boy, which draws from Jim Akutsu's life story. But as you said, the character of Ichiro Yamada in the novel is not the personality of your father. when Ichiro is spat upon in Act 1, Scene 1 of the book, Ichiro just, recoils and shies away. Whereas, what would your father have done if he were spat upon by a Nisei veteran and called,
Yeah.
no, boy, shit on you?
Yeah, yeah. My people who knew my dad knew that he had a pretty fiery personality, and that even as a young man, he didn't put up with what he said. He didn't put up with too much guff, and so he also really, even when he was talking to me about being, in a team, was that he would stand up for people who were being picked on. So he had this real sense of what was just and what was right. And so if something like that happened, there would be, as my father would say, hell to pay for that. And he would have, right, responded in kind, right, in that sense. But I would say he wasn't a violent man or an aggressive man, but he was a very passionate person. And again, when you get your black belt in kendo at 15, you know how to handle yourself. So he would have responded in that way. So
I did not know that.
yeah,
I know his father had him take kendo before the war, but that's interesting.
yeah,
When we included the story of him, as he put it, we banged up the cook in Minidoka who was stealing Thanksgiving turkeys for their family. And I just love the phrase he used of banging him up.
yeah.
And we put that in the script. But he would not take any crap from anyone. And you mentioned other parts that Okada drew from your father's story. In researching I got the transcript and all of I got your grandfather's file from the Enemy Alien Hearing Board. And it had all of your grandmother's letters to the Attorney General, your father's letters to the Attorney General, pleading for your father's release from the DOJ internment camp in Missoula, and your grandfather's interview with the FBI. And that is what appears in the book. Was that all new to you? The seeing your father's father and your father's mother portrayed in the book that way?
Oh, you're talking about Nono Boy or the graphic?
No. I'm talking about Kiyonosuke, your grandfather,
Yep.
and Nao, your grandmother.
Yeah. My father didn't talk a lot about my grandparents. My grandmother passed a couple of years after the war ended, right? And unfortunately, she had a hard time in building her life back after the war, and because of, I think, the negativity that also was thrust upon her with having, her sons being resistors.
Right.
So I never met her, and my grandfather passed when I think I was about maybe 3. So, but my father did talk about them. He talked about the difficulties that they went through, that, right, he didn't see his father for a while, and that when he was told his father was going to arrive at the camp, that he didn't recognize his father, right, and that he had lost so much weight, and also he spoke about how his mother worried and how all those things. So those things he did share, but again, I think when John Okada's book Nono Boy became popular again, I think in the late 70s and 80s, I got a copy and I read it. So, and then that's when I had further conversations with my dad about what part of this is sort of like your experience and what part isn't, right? And so, in that sense, I think my father wanted to share some of this information with my sister and I as we're growing up, to let us know that he had made these decisions and that some people still saw him in a negative light because of those decisions, but to prepare us in case, and to say, look, don't feel sorry for me. I don't feel sorry for myself. So that's who he was, right?
Yeah. I should ask you, Philip, did anyone at Franklin High School or before talk to you about your father? I mean, do you call your father bad names?
I never really experienced that, right? And a
Okay.
lot of my friends who came over, they already knew my dad was going to start talking about the internment. I mean, I would have to oftentimes, sort of prepare them. And my mother would say things like, Jim, they don't really want to hear this, right? Because I think my mother at some point felt like, these are young people coming over. They're just, right, wanting to hang out. And my dad would all he loved talking to people.
He
So,
did. He
I
really
mean,
did.
and it wasn't just about the internment, he could talk about a lot of things. He was just a friendly, outgoing person, but very much felt like, especially people my age and friends who were my age, that they needed to know about these stories because the stories
Yeah.
weren't coming out enough. And I think as later on in life, as I think the next generation uh, became more interested, I think he felt really good about going to colleges and being able to
Yes.
talk about those experiences. And not for, I think, drawing attention to himself, but bringing attention to the whole experience, right? And speaking for his parents, who obviously weren't alive to talk about their experience, and to really communicate that to the young people who oftentimes would say, well, if this happened to me, I wouldn't do it, but
Yeah.
to really help them understand how difficult it was and that it was a different time. But to share with them his experience, and hopefully their interest would increase in wanting to know more about that. So.
Two more questions. Can you fill in his life after the war, your father's life, into the 60s and 70s, his job and also his work with youth?
Yeah, so after the war, he went back and he tried to bring some normalcy to the Japanese American community. So he organized dances, and he was a coach for like basketball and youth sports within the Japanese American community. He always gave back. He worked for the city of Seattle as an engineer, and one of his proudest moments was he helped to build a dam up near Spokane with a bunch of other individuals. So that was I remember he was very proud to have us go visit, and he, showed us the dam that he helped contribute to build.
The Sketchy River Dam? The
Um,
Sketchy River?
no, I can't remember the name right
Okay.
offhand, but
Okay.
yeah, yeah,
Oh,
it's close to Spokane.
okay.
And then later on, right, he even after I stopped being involved in sort of youth sports and Boy Scouts, he continued. Right, he was a scout
He was
master.
Scoutmaster, wasn't he? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and so and then he continued to try to serve in kind of social causes, right? I mean, he reached out to Native American tribes. He had some connections with certain fishing industries, so he was trying to negotiate a way for the Native Americans to develop exchange, right, with their fishing rights, so that they could send some of their fish to Japan and get the funds to then help the individuals living on the reservation. So he
Got it.
always had sort of this kind part of him, this generous part of him that wanted to help individuals. So.
Last question. We show the drawing of your father at the end of the book testifying to the fact finding commission. What did he tell you about the redress check that he received, and how he planned to use it?
Yeah, I really felt good that my father finally had his day in court, more or less, and he got to tell his story, and that he got his public apology. And I told my father, I said, I'm glad that you finally got the apology and you got the redress check. And I said, you should do something special with that. And he told me that, no, that was money that was going to be set aside and kept safe for my sister and I. And I said, well, I didn't go through the camps. I didn't suffer through that. That's for you. And he said, well, his mother and father lost everything when they went to the camps. And he said, if things hadn't been that way, they might have been able to give something more to you, right, my sister and I. And so he said, that's a gift that he's going to protect, because it's something that his parents might have wanted to share with us. And I kept telling him that it wasn't necessary, but you know how they are, that generation. And so um, that I think that really speaks to how he felt about his time in the internment.
And to his character, just a wonderful, generous man. Well, thank you very much, Philip, for sharing your feelings, your memories. Why don't we, Kimiko, go to all five of us now and have a chance to share. Wonderful. Here we all are. Wendy, Soji. I think we have no audience questions yet. And please, if you have any questions, please put them in the comments, and Tamika will pass them along. Soji, I wanted to ask you real quickly myself. In the graphic novel, you mentioned that a lot of people would ostracize the no-nos and renunciants. And of course, you know the history yourself. In reading the treatment of it in a graphic novel, do you feel like we helped solve the question or answer the question of why, what drove those who refused to answer the questionnaire? Did you like the way we turned it on its head by saying, it's not a question of our loyalty, it's the country that's not loyal to us?
Yeah, I thought that was, exactly, turning it on its head, changing the whole way people look at it, because it was really, it should be put on the government for what the government did to our people, and so I really like that, how you did that.
Oh, wonderful. Well, I think this is a chance for the three, Philip, Wendy, Soji, a chance for you to meet yourselves. Are there any questions you have of each other that you want to find out more about?
I have one.
Yes.
This is regarding when I was going to school in Chicago. I went to Chicago Public School in the 60s. And of course, not knowing, about the Japanese, my mom and everything. And I used to get anti-Japanese name calling, and which I really, being in like third, fourth grade, had no idea what all this was about. They would say, Jap, go back home. And I'm thinking, what is this all about? So I was just wanted to know with Soji and Philip, if you ever experienced any of that while you were going to school, or...
Philip?
I didn't really experience that. I mean, there was prejudice and discrimination, but it wasn't in specific to, I think, relating to the internment. I went to school in the inner city, so there were a lot of students of color, right? And so each, I think, group could tell a story about their lives where their families were facing prejudice and discrimination. So I didn't feel that I faced any that was specific to sort of the Japanese American community and the internment in that sense. But that was the question. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, I got some of that. I remember that in elementary school and also junior high school. It felt like going to battle on some days and it was always over being Japanese or being Asian. People making comments about my tie-dyes or, stuff like that. But then I ended up going to high school, which was like 70% Asian. And so all that kind of ended. So high school was a relief.
Right.
But it was pretty rough up until that point.
Yeah, I agree. Same for myself. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just curious.
Matter then, right? It was because you went in San Francisco, Soji, right?
Yeah. The Lowell High School. Yeah.
And I'm also curious, does anyone, I don't speak Japanese. There was, I guess, my parents, it must have been the time that I was never taught. I mean, I know words, but I was just wondering if Soji or Philip, you speak Japanese, or your parents spoke Japanese to you, or if you went to Japanese school, or...
Yep. Yeah. My mom's from Japan, so I know Japanese pretty mildly in that sense. I did go to Japanese school. I remember I complained about why I was going to Japanese school, when other kids got to spend the weekend doing other things. But, I appreciated learning some of that. And even now, I would say I have some skills with Japanese. Yeah, hon no skoshi.
Oh, that's wonderful.
I took Japanese class in junior high school and also high school, but really didn't learn how to speak Japanese in either. My parents both speak Japanese, but we didn't speak Japanese at home. And sometimes they would speak a little bit of Japanese to each other, but not to us. Maybe they didn't want us to know what they were saying. I have no idea.
Same thing here.
With,
That's how my house is too. Yeah.
Yeah,
yeah,
you don't really realize how much Japanese is filtering in because you grew up with it. It isn't until you have friends who come over where, they're there for dinner and it's a mixture of Japanese and English, but you never hear the difference, at least in my house,
Yeah.
right?
yeah.
So that's the fascinating thing about growing up with a different language.
Right, right. Soji, you're so right. My mom spoke to her parents in Japanese. My dad, because he was from Hawaii, it was kind of like a broken Japanese, they said, because he kind of knew some of the words, Japanese words, and didn't. But I asked my mom, why didn't we learn, Mom? What? And she says, oh, you just didn't want to learn. I mean, that's what she said to us. And I'm thinking, really? Okay.
No, I think that was one of the one of the worst things that happened to us.
Yes.
Was our loss of our language.
Yes, exactly.
And
I so regret it today. I even, like you, Soji, I tried to go to a high school to learn. I was just, I guess, at that age where nothing, set into my head. It was really hard.
Well, the government told Japanese Americans don't speak Japanese when they left camp.
Yeah.
And so a lot of our parents' generation took that to heart and did not speak it at home. And in some households, I've heard that Japanese was not allowed to be spoken inside the house.
Oh, my mom said she was at school talking Japanese to friends, and the teacher came by and said, "You're in America, you speak English."
Yeah. So they were getting it. Yeah. They were getting it on both sides.
Yeah. So, I'm very sad that I don't know the language. So.
You're not alone, though.
This is true. We are having some questions come in from the audience. So there's a question from Alden Hayashi, and Wendy's spoken about this a little bit. But Alden wants to know, is there anything you regret not telling or asking your parents?
That's a good one.
That's a good one. Wendy, anything? Wendy?
Not or asking my parents.
Or telling.
Yeah. I regret not asking my dad. I asked my mom more questions. I mean, I initiated it. But as far as my dad had died, and he passed away in 1987. So I kind of wasn't quite ready asking all the questions, trying to get all the information. But I regret that I never asked him, hey, Dad, what happened when you came from Hawaii and then you went to Sacramento College, and then what were your feelings that they took you out of the college and they put you in internment camp? And I am sorry that I wasn't able to ask him those questions. So.
Phillip, Soji?
Soji? Yeah.
I was thinking just in today's discussion about my dad, and I'm just sorry that he felt this sense of shame, or he just didn't feel like he could talk about who he was back then and share it with us and the family, because I would have been interested in knowing a lot more. So if there's a regret, I wish I could have talked to him more about what happened, instead of just not talking about it at all. Yeah.
Phillip, anything?
Yeah, I mean, Frank, you knew my father, so he was very open about experience, and so from an early age, I think he made sure that I did learn about those things, and hopefully how it impacted him, as well as he hoped that from learning this that I would try to probably stand up against social injustice when I saw it. So I don't really have too many regrets, I mean, in regards to that.
We have another question from Ken Mochizuki, and though the three of you have talked about the first question, maybe we can talk about the second part of the question. So the first part of the question is, do you wish that they would have talked about their camp experiences earlier? But the second question is, would it have made a difference in how you viewed yourself? Mm. So if we go back to Wendy, maybe, and then go back to Soji and Phillip.
How I viewed myself.
If your mom had talked about camp, or your parents had talked about camp earlier, do you think it would have made a difference in how you saw yourself?
Maybe, I think so. I would have, given me more time with them. Mm. Yeah. More time with them, more time especially with my mom, to just find out, details, which she never, volunteered to. I mean, she was very limited as far as, what she wanted to let us know about, her experience in the internment camps. Yeah.
Soji?
Yeah, I think it would have made a big difference. If I had learned about what he went through earlier, just because of how I feel about it today and now, how different I feel about the protest and the resistance, and that it was a pure form of being an American, expressing that protest and dissent. It's really essential core to being American. And so growing up, if I had known that, I think it would have helped me understand myself a lot better.
Thank you.
I think my father would have liked others to speak about the internment. I mean, I think he did a pretty solid job of communicating that to me and other people. But growing up, we socialized with other families that were resistors, and when we got together for picnics or family gatherings or holidays, they didn't like to speak about it, right? I mean, I think there was a part of them that said it's better not spoken about. It was something that happened. I don't know if they're embarrassed about it or not, but when my father would start talking about it, you could tell that they had some ambivalence about having him talk about this. But I think my father said that we needed to really talk about these things, and I'm glad that people started to talk about it, especially during the redress, right? This is the first time that a lot of families ever spoke about that to their kids, and unfortunately, it was many years after the war, right? About 40 years later, and it was the first time that many family members were finally getting a chance to talk about these things that they were ashamed of or ambivalent about. I know that when my father shared this with me at a very young age, I had to think about this, and I think my sister had to think about this, is what would we have done, right, if we were put in the same place? Would we have had the courage to resist, right? And what would we have done? And so I think it really instilled in us in a very early age about the difficult decisions that you may be faced with and what happens, in those situations. Then it's easy to say what you would do versus what you actually do. And so I think in that sense, that very much shaped me as I was growing up about these type of decisions, and how they affect you in your life, right, in many ways.
Yeah, that's really powerful hearing from all of you. Our last question, I think, is from Teru Kanazawa, and they want to know, in terms of your legacy from your parents, how do you see the best way that you've found to impart the lessons to younger generations? And we'll maybe go back to Wendy, if that's okay.
That's a good one. These are some tough questions.
They are.
Yeah. You know, I think the best way is just like everyone's saying, communication. I mean, you need to talk about it. And you know, my daughters ask me questions, and I try to give them answers. And not only that, lessons to my children. There are books now that they can read. I didn't have a book at the time where I could read about my mom or what happened, and I think that helps a lot too. And from that, they learn about what she went through. But then, like I said, they can come to me anytime and just ask me, and I'll tell them what I know. They have an uncle who knows. My brother knows a lot more. And just like I said, communication.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Soji.
Yeah, I feel like when my dad passed away, there was like this baton that got handed over to me to carry on in his spirit and of speaking out against what's not right, speaking out against injustice, and just telling his story, telling our story, so the younger generations can understand and learn and be proud of who we are.
You did a lot through the arts. Phillip?
For me, I've been very fortunate because I'm a college professor. And so when I was at University of Michigan, I was part of the Asian Pacific Islander American Studies and taught Intro to Asian American Studies. And so it gave me a chance to talk about a lot of the history of different Asian groups, including Japanese Americans, and to, show videos like Frank's documentary, Conscience and the Constitution, as parts to educate young people. I now teach fully in psychology, but I do teach classes in culture. And so my class in multicultural psychology, we look at some of the history of different ethnic minority groups, and we do cover Asian Americans, and we talk about the internment. And so again, some of my students in my current class were given a link to this. So they may be watching me right now. They're not getting points for this, but it's mainly to really, I think, give them an opportunity to hear about sort of the history and make sure, as my father said, always speak up, share, don't let them forget about what happened.
Thank you, Phillip. Well, that's our thank you, Teru and Ken and Alden, for your questions. We've run out of time. It's really remarkable to have the three of you here in one space to look at, the progeny of our three characters, each of whom stood up for a principle, for a cause, for justice, and to see, they did it. I mean, they did it for you guys, really. I mean, for their children, I think. So, any last thoughts, anyone? Phillip, Wendy, Soji, any last thoughts? If not, we'll thank you for your time, and we'll stay in touch. We'll stay in touch, and thank you all for your assistance with the graphic novel We Hereby Refuse, and for your acceptance of our sharing the story of your parent.
Yes, thank you for your trust. We appreciate it.
That's the
Thank
word.
you.
Yes, that's
Thank
the
you all.
Thank you. Thanks
Thank
for
you
having
very
us.
much. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Phillip. Thank you, Soji. Thank you, Tamiko. Thank you, Kimiko. Thank you all
Thank
for
you.
watching, and we'll say good evening.